Kia ora koutou. Thank you so much for coming this afternoon, everyone. And thank you to Sans for hosting this discussion and Stella for chairing this meeting. So this paper contains the preliminary findings of my master's research, which I started in July this year under the supervision of Avril. And this project is investigating the experiences of Pākehā students learning about settler colonialism and New Zealand history within higher educational settings in New Zealand. So it's seeking to understand the ongoing impact of colonialism on student reception to this teaching, whether the emotions students feel during their lessons affect the way they view the content, and their desires to undertake further study on New Zealand history or involvement in politics, activism, community work. So to explore these questions, I've interviewed 8 self-identified Pākehā students. These students were all enrolled in a 100-level sociology course, and many of them were taking it as a general education paper. So just to give you a brief overview of the next 15 minutes, I'm going to start with an introduction to the debates around the value of teaching these so-called difficult histories in colonial contexts. I'll then move on to some of my interview material. So I've sorted my quotes into 3 themes. Firstly, what I've called this aha moment, which is this switch or change that many of these students have experienced from viewing New Zealand through an individual lens to more of a sociological lens, and the realizations that come with this about Pākehā and Māori history and identity. Then I'll go over the emotions that these students have experienced as a result of learning about these topics. And finally, I'll move on to some of the complexities and the paradoxes of the situation. So the disavowals, deflections, and disassociations that these Pākehā students make when thinking about their own connections to New Zealand's history. So the debate around education and pedagogy as a tool for decolonisation and anti-racism work requires some unpacking to justify the premise of this project. So many decolonial educational scholars have contested the popular assumption that more knowledge and more compelling arguments can be an antidote to racism and intolerance. Several scholars have taken issue with the simplistic link between knowledge accumulation and changed behaviour. Other scholars have highlighted that it's mostly white students that are empowered by this premise. So multicultural education becomes a tool in maintaining this Western fantasy of absolute knowledge that Avril spoke about. Still others have noted that teaching about the culture and history of a people may be one of the least political and least assertive types of anti-racist action. And that even with that in mind, it's possible to deliver this education in ways that completely ignores the effect of colonisation and white privilege and avoids more challenging discussions about power relations and racism. Paulette Regan points out that many settlers never move beyond denial and guilt in the face of difficult histories, as the dominant majority is prone to reinforce imperial and colonial attitudes in this teaching in ways that are antithetical to decolonisation. So with these important debates in mind, I contend that classroom encounters can still be radical, transformative, confronting, or traumatic experiences for settler students, while remaining cognizant of the temptation to instrumentalize the possibilities of education and pedagogy as quick fix solutions to colonialism, or as an escape from ongoing neo-colonial and oppressive tendencies in academia. So this brings me to my first point in the presentation, which is this aha moment. So every student I interviewed spoke of the value that they saw in learning about New Zealand's history and studying sociology. All of these students had experienced some kind of change or transformation in their views, some of them quite radical changes, whether it be their understandings of New Zealand history and society, their attitudes towards Māori and Pacifica, or their understandings of Pākehā identity. The common theme here was this switch from an individual view of history and society to more of a sociological lens. All of these students were highly critical of New Zealand's colonial history and could see the link between colonisation and the current situation in New Zealand today in terms of ongoing racism experienced by Māori and Pacific peoples. All the names that I've used in these quotes are pseudonyms, but I've kept the course where it's relevant. I apologise that the quotes are all quite lengthy, but I wanted to give you a feel of the kind of conversational and confessional nature of the interview. So I have the full quotes up on the slides, but I'm going to read some more concise versions. So this first student was a medical student who'd taken sociology as a general education paper. And she said, "I definitely feel relieved that I'm kind of able to get the full picture, because that definitely changes my perspectives. Like for me, before I was like, oh, like it's their fault, you know, always drinking and stuff like that. So I definitely feel relieved for taking this course. It kind of made me understand that, hey, Katie, you shouldn't just be blaming the Indigenous people of that country or New Zealand. I didn't know that before I took sociology. So I know that my behaviours and the way and how I would interact with a specific person definitely was influenced by that." I think Katie's opinions are quite uncomfortable to hear, but I think they reflect the way that many Pākehā speak around dinner tables in the course of doing their ordinary jobs and discussions in pubs. Learning about New Zealand's history had prompted quite a radical reevaluation of her views about society and history, particularly within the context of her medical degree. This next student, Megan, was a population health student who was also taking sociology as a general education paper. So Megan said, it's been so revolutionary for me that I'm like, it's changed the way that I just view New Zealand in general. Now I can apply this to mental health statistics, for example. I'll be looking at it and going into my population health courses, and I'll see the stats and I'll be like, this is because of colonisation. But I definitely hadn't made any unconscious link between colonisation and the effects on Māori until this course. So while these assessments of New Zealand society are lacking some nuance, they still suggest that studying sociology was a very valuable experience for these students, especially those coming from outside the arts. However, these realizations aren't necessarily an easy experience for these students. One of the things that I am particularly interested in is how the difficult aspect of learning about colonial histories emerges not solely from the content or the issue itself, but is experienced in the emotional response brought out by that content. And this project came about from my experience as a teaching assistant for an undergraduate history course in Canada. So when I taught these classes and we covered Canadian colonial histories, my mostly white settler students struggled with the connections between the histories they were learning about and the present situation in Canada. So the emotions that many of my students expressed, guilt, anger, fear, frustration, sadness, told me something about the way that they saw themselves as settlers and how they saw Canadian history. The students that I interviewed for this project expressed many similar emotions to those named by my Canadian students, with guilt and sadness being the main themes. A notable number of students worried about what this history meant for their identity and belonging as Pākehā, and what a real reckoning with New Zealand's history would mean in terms of material changes to their everyday lives. So I'll run through a few quotes. This first quote is from Serena, who was a law student. So she said, "And all of these things that affect Māori so much differently to how it affects me, it's heavy stuff. And sometimes it is kind of hard to interact with because you do feel a sort of sense of guilt, even though, you know, I didn't come here and I didn't colonialize them. I didn't enforce all of these laws that took away their culture. But because it's still so present within our kind of day-to-day. And I think also people either don't realize that or don't want to deal with it properly. I feel like there's still this large tension And I feel like that's why probably some people have issues. Well, I feel really confronted or upset and have strong emotions because that's why I do properly. Because I feel learning about history and learning about kind of sociology and how it's affecting other people, that you can, especially in sociology, I think this course I felt kind of the tension, not in the air of the classroom, but kind of in the air of New Zealand. So I think that it's been this course especially has made me, yeah, like I said before, I just wanted to cry and I couldn't really explain why, because I was just so frustrated and tense about a situation that I haven't caused, but I'm definitely benefiting from. I'm going to read this top quote here, which is quite similar, but back to Megan, she adds a bit of a different angle. So Megan said, initially I definitely just felt like quite guilty. And I'm like, how did I not even know this? Like, why did my ancestors decide to come here and then just like caused all of this destruction? And then it just keeps on going. There was a bit of like imposter syndrome, like, should I even be here? The difficult emotions that these students have experienced in and outside the classroom are indicative of a deep emotional attachment to a particular identity formation on the part of the white settler community as good, belonging New Zealanders. We can see this in Serena's difficulties in taking or placing blame for colonisation, in Megan's worries that maybe she doesn't belong in New Zealand. The lack and loss of these identity formations and the coded white safe spaces of the classroom is destabilizing. We should not be surprised then that these students feel uncertain, angry, frustrated, guilty, sad. But at the same time, to say these emotions are not surprising is not to condone them or excuse them. One of the key structuring elements of settler nations, as Eva Mackey reminds us, is the ways in which colonial power shapes perceptions of reality for settlers, creating an illusion of the inevitability of existing power relations. So this brings me on to my final point for today, which is essentially the cognitive hoops that many of these students jump through to come to terms with their own connections to New Zealand history. All of the students that I spoke to expressed overwhelmingly critical views about the nature and impact of colonisation in New Zealand. They recognised that the impacts of this history reverberate in the present with destructive consequences, especially for Māori. Having learned about New Zealand's history, these students saw the historical role of Pākehā in New Zealand as a shameful role, one that they abhorred any connection with. As a result, despite their professed feelings of guilt and sadness, many of these students disavowed any ties to New Zealand history. Many of them struggled to make a connection between the actions of early Pākehā and the privilege they experienced as white New Zealanders in the present. Their sociological lens, to return to that first point that I made, extended to recognising the impact of colonisation for Māori, but not for themselves. So for these quotes, I've included my questions just for some clarity. So this is Serena again, the law student. And I asked her, can you describe your sense of connection with New Zealand's history? Serena responded, I think I still feel a bit like an outsider. And I think that that still has to do with my ethnicity and kind of being a Pākehā. It feels almost, I feel like I don't belong there, if that makes sense. And I'm not welcome there by some people, which is probably, it's not true, but it's just kind of that guilt internalizing itself. And I asked her, what about Pākehā history? She replied, no, I think I feel the most segregated, I guess, from them, like not at all. I think that's probably why I feel so not disconnected, but not belonging to New Zealand history, because I don't belong to them at all. I don't want to. This next quote is Megan, who is the population health student. I asked her again, do you feel connected to New Zealand's history of colonisation? And Megan said, I can't say that I do, because I've never I've never seen like the process of taking the land away. It's just the connection to the present that I focus on. But yeah, I wouldn't say that I feel that connected to it. I don't think that I associate that specifically with, like, I don't emotionally connect with my like New Zealand history specifically. And it could also be because my family doesn't really talk about like history very much. And I think that like only one of my grandparents is still alive. This is the final long quote that I'm going to read. This is from Ellie, who is an art student. She said, "One of my ancestors got a huge amount of their land through like a ballot and things like that. And realizing like my family was built on stolen land, like their life was built on stolen land, and the generations after that, which does include me, you know, not that I own the land anymore, but they set us up for that." And I asked her how that made her feel. She said, "I think it's a little bit shameful in terms of, I don't know, even with Māori people being able to talk about their heritage, and it just seems so beautiful. But then I don't want to talk about that heritage that I have because I know that it's not good and it's unfair. So therefore, yeah, it's just a little bit shameful that I don't talk about it a huge amount." And I asked her, "Do you think that your family history is something you'd feel comfortable sharing if you were in a class discussing similar topics? Or is that something you'd keep quiet?" And Ellie said, "I think that I could share it, but I wouldn't want to associate myself with it. I'd want to distance myself from it and say that those ideas that they had are not the ideas that I have and I want to have, you know?" I wish I had more space and time to explore these complexities. These students use various strategies to disavow their complicity in historical and ongoing colonisation. A key theme was not sharing the perceived views of early settlers, distancing themselves through family connections, or refusing to recognise the ways this history shapes their present-day lives. I think the final point I'll end on here is that encounters with difficult histories can be a deeply unsettling onto epistemological experience for settler students, one that troubles the core foundation of their identity and belonging as settlers in settler nations. This is a concept that several scholars have called settler ontological security, and that Avril has called ontological unease. I think we can see in some of these last few quotes that desire these students have to see themselves as good, belonging New Zealanders. It's extremely challenging for educators and for students to engage in this difficult teaching and learning that disrupts this security, especially as it manifests in the difficult emotions that I explored above. I've got one final thought that I want to end on, particularly in light of some of the discussions that happened earlier this week on social media with regards to this session. One of my colleagues from the University of British Columbia in Canada, Sharon Stein, has written recently about the ways that many universities in Canada and abroad have attempted to indigenize in recent years. So often making commitments to hire more Indigenous faculty, recruit more Indigenous students, incorporate Indigenous content, and strengthen relationships with local Indigenous communities. These efforts have largely proven inadequate to the task of transforming higher education, Sharon argues, notably because we can't even begin the process of changing the relationship between settlers, Indigenous peoples, and the academy, until settlers are willing to face the full extent to which colonial violence has shaped higher educational institutions in countries like New Zealand and Canada for hundreds of years. So while these Pākehā students that I interviewed are facing their own challenge in coming to terms with difficult histories, I think higher educational institutions and all of us working within them face their and our own responsibility with regards to our own complicity in historical and ongoing settler colonialism and the ways that manifests in our everyday academic practice. So that's my final thought. I'll welcome any questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see all of you.
Thank you, Rosie. That was a really informative presentation. So those of you who don't have your silences on, you could clap, and the rest of you can put the emoji up there. Yeah, really appreciated that your research in that. Are there any questions or comments or discussions that people would like to raise with Rosie? Just feel free to unmute yourself and pose that question.
Yeah, I've got a kind of observation-y / question-y thing that that I was sort of thinking about. I really enjoyed that, Rosalynd. I thought that was really interesting, and it kind of squares with my own sort of observations of teaching difficult histories to students. And one of the sort of, it's not a question so much as well, I suppose it is really, is to what extent do you see like the potential for the kind of dialogue that Avril was talking about in her presentation being one of the things that would be really useful here? You know, it's one thing, you know, for Pākehā students to confront their colonial history as a kind of discomforting aspect of their past. You know, for Māori in you know, with the sort of sense of whakapapa, you kind of have to take the uncomfortable stories with the positive ones in this kind of chain, and I just wonder if that might be something that would be sort of worthy kind of considering, like a kind of, you know, as you sort of like advance in this kind of thinking. I'm not sure if that came across as a question or a or just a rambling nonsense, but if there's any part of that you can talk to, please feel free.
Yeah, I think one of the things that came out quite clearly in this research is that these students had taken away from this history this learning, this very black and white, Maori histories are good, settler histories are bad. I don't want any involvement with that, rather than this kind of embracing of a more interwoven, complex history that involved various kind of complicities and complexities. So I think a move towards teaching and supporting settler students in a way that allows them to embrace this whole package of New Zealand's history and Pākehā histories, and doesn't just involve disavowing the kind of bad bits and the ugly bits and refusing that connection with them, is actually where we need to get to have any kind of forward-looking responsibility from this history. Because just saying, I don't accept that history, I'm not connected to that bad history, kind of gets us nowhere in the present. So I very much on your point think that idea of our histories involving both the good and the bad is a very fruitful line of kind of inquiry and teaching.
Yeah, thank you. That was, yeah, cool.
Thanks for that, Rosie. That was really interesting. I also teach a first year course that raises some of these difficult conversations for students, and I absolutely, as Matthew said, that resonates with my own experiences of students. It also strikes me, however, that it represents a certain cohort of the students who would want to take part in a research project talking about their experiences, because the other cohort, or the other end of the cohort, are the ones with their arms firmly, you know, folded and their minds firmly closed, going, yes, but what about all the benefits of colonisation? Let us never forget the benefits of colonisation. I'd love to get them into research space, but I think that would be difficult to lure them in. I'm guessing that you did just ask for volunteers from the cohort.
Yeah.
Is there anything you'd want to say about that sampling process, or, you know, like that kind of thing?
I recruited from across 2 courses, so I think it was between 600 and 700 students that I was targeting. And I tried to be relatively vague in terms of not kind of giving this decolonial slant to my materials, because those were the students I wanted the opinions of as well. But I think partly due to just the nature of how COVID has affected this term. The recruitment was quite hard in general. It was all done in recorded lectures that I'm not sure many students even watched. And all the students that ended up volunteering were kind of already quite socially minded, mostly women. Most of them wanted to be involved because they had a kind of professed interest in this. They've been thinking about the topics and wanted to kind of see what others were thinking about it. So yeah, I would love to expand the project and find a way to capture those, that kind of whole spectrum of opinions. But it did end up being quite interesting the way that these students were kind of had a professed commitment to causes like feminism and anti-racism and an interest in the topic, and still had all these kind of funny hoops they were jumping with. So it ended up being quite interesting the way it worked out, but yeah.
It would be interesting to see their responses to seeing those hoops laid out and, you know, analysed, because I think, you know, we don't realise the work that we're doing in our talk of excusing and shifting and all the rest of it. And I think for students like that who are so engaged in the ideas, it'll actually be really fascinating for them, assuming that they, you know, will see the writer to understand that work that's happening for them. So yeah, thanks. That was really interesting.
Yeah, I think your idea of this disavowal of histories is a sort of a, I don't know, without trivializing, a sort of a neat psychological trick to not having to own, you know, what is going on in the present and in terms of, you know, well, hey, in terms of what's going on in the present. And I wonder if your participants realise that, or just yet haven't engaged at a deeper level with the issue. What's your sense of that?
I think you kind of really nailed it there, that it is this psychological trick, and that saying these histories are bad, but they're not connected to them, allows them to leave that colonisation in the past as something that happened and was sad, but that they in the present are not implicated in. But I was also mostly talking to very young students. They were kind of 18, 19. And I interviewed a couple of older students that had just taken this course to kind of catch up some requirements. And I did notice that they had a more mature view of this. And I could kind of push them more on this topic and point out where there was this kind of dissonance and they were contradicting themselves and saying how guilty and sad they felt about something, but then saying it's got nothing to do with me and it hasn't affected my life in the present. So I do wonder, and it's a direction Avril and I have discussed moving the project in, if you interviewed honours and master's students, if they were to have a much more mature and developed kind of appreciation of this historical lens, I guess, and the way it affects both Pākehā and Māori in the present.
I suspect it would be a reflection of the level of their study rather than their age, as in the course that I teach, which does have a lot of older students, they're still brand new to thinking in this way, and so their age doesn't necessarily give them that kind of mature lens on things.
It will be interesting to see when, you know, New Zealand history gets brought into the school curriculum, whether that changes, you know, sort of like what's coming through at this end. I teach on the same course that Ella does, and so, you know, sort of know what she's talking about there with those students, because we get lots of students who go, how did we not know this? Like, how come, you know, so a lot of that history is really new for people, and I'm wondering if their first reaction is, you know, distancing themselves from that in order to be able to deal with that. So it would actually be really interesting to do some follow-up research on this once that high school curriculum has been, you know, sort of instituted and rolled out for a few years.
Mm-hmm. And the first part of my interview actually covered what they learned in school, how the course they'd taken at the university shaped up to that. And that frustration and surprise at not having learnt this was a very common theme in all their responses, even if they'd had quite extensive history education. Lots of frustration and kind of, I guess, unplaced blame in terms of whose fault it was that they'd never learned this before, and what would have happened if they'd never learned this.
Hey, I just thank you, Rosie. It was great, and I, of course, as you know, I'm also a teacher of one of these things, one of these kinds of courses at times. I'm just interested in the whole emotions thing, and and I'm just thinking, what do you think? Do you think we should? That's something we should actually broach directly in class. That maybe that's something we could add to what we teach, and it's not just. And I think, these difficult emotions for Māori students in these classes too, isn't it? I mean, that one, they may know this stuff already, and doesn't mean it doesn't stops hurting, but they may also be learning some of it. They're not necessarily knowing everything that we're talking about, not necessarily also, let alone thinking about it sociologically. But do you think, if we actually outed the fact that this is emotional stuff, it's not just about facts, learning some facts, do you think that would be beneficial?
Yeah, I think one of the things I was really interested in is how these emotions can sit and exist within the classroom. And I think lots of these students had never said this to anyone before, let alone said it within that tutorial or lecture context. So the ways that teaching assistants or lecturers could kind of create space for those emotions and what they mean within the classroom, I think could be a really fruitful way, or a way to stop students going away and just looking back and saying, oh, that made me feel angry and guilty and sad. I don't want that experience again. But I think also, at least what I found in my teaching, is that the emotions that tend to take up the space in the classroom tend to be those of the upset, white, often male, very confident students, which kind of results in the Indigenous students not being the target of those emotions, but having to listen to settlers talk about how upset they are about settlers settling, basically. And I think educators would need to be very careful that that burden doesn't just fall on the Indigenous students and other minority students in their classrooms.
Absolutely.
Could I just jump in quickly? Sorry. I was just thinking of that point that Avril said about bringing in emotion. I've read an article by Adele Norris, some of you might have read it as well, but just kind of talking about how she uses, she points out that students are responding with these emotions of guilt and shame and whatnot to highlight that there is a problem that needs to be discussed. So I kind of thought that connected quite well, but also in the same article, she kind of talks about how guilt is kind of an inevitable emotion amongst when you're confronting these difficult histories and such. And there's a kind of an unhealthy guilt and a healthy guilt. So it can be a productive thing as well. And I was kind of looking at these ideas and also noting that I'm friends with Leah Bell, and she said that when she discovered that she's got this in a published article, so I'm not completely giving a personal anecdote. She said that when she discovered that her ancestor was involved in the New Zealand Wars, then guilt and shame is all she felt, even though she's at the time of writing, she was a third-year history student specializing in New Zealand. She's really historically conscious, and she knows that guilt and shame are bad emotions, but that was all she felt. So I was kind of in an essay for my honors course this year, I was kind of building off these and kind of thinking about whether or not it could be helpful to introduce, alongside all of the the brutal impact of colonization and all the New Zealand wars and everything, whether it's helpful to bring in little glimmers of hope, little tiny fragments where Pākehā have kind of dissented to the idea of whiteness and colonization in the past. And you can't champion those moments because they've got their own constraints and limits. And like, if you were to put them in equal conversation with the broader trajectory of colonization, that's going to be very imbalanced, because you're saying that these little small moments are as big as the, you know, New Zealand Wars or something. But kind of like, I guess, building on the idea that maybe that's a helpful way to kind of ease feelings of guilt, so you can kind of realize that our history is something that we can connect with, rather than only being a source of guilt and shame, if that's something that's going to be inevitable, I suppose, and because it can exist in a healthy way. I'm not sure if that sort of, like, those sort of ideas are useful to your research, or if you have any thoughts on that, but that's kind of like my thinking as this conversation has been going on.
Mm-hmm. I'll respond. I think there's kind of almost 2 points there. And this project, the whole master's project, actually came out from my own experience grappling with my complicity and responsibility towards colonial histories as a white British person who has migrated to countries like Canada and New Zealand. And I did a history master's before my sociology master's. And even as a first year history master's student who had done a whole honours degree, I found myself with those same feelings, that kind of guilt and shame, and how was I ever going to not only come to terms with this, but how was I ever going to actually do the kind of academic work that I wanted to do? And so that's kind of, in a positive way, that's where this project came from, that I kind of took my own emotions and those that I saw my students experiencing and wanted to look at how we could work with that in the classroom. And on your second point about, do we add some more kind of complexity into the history? I think it relates quite well to Matthew's point about this broader, more complex view of history. And it was something I tried to push a little bit in the interviews, where these students were very talking about how bad colonization was and how bad all Pākehā were, and especially those that they knew their family connections. I asked them a few questions along the lines of, do you feel any empathy for what your ancestors experienced kind of coming over to a new country and building a life from nothing? Do you kind of have any understanding for them? And they weren't questions the students could answer, to be honest. And I didn't push them because we didn't have much time in the interviews. But I think that direction could possibly trouble this binary of just good and bad that I think some of these students kind of split their view of history into, and that enables them to make themselves sit outside that history because they're not a bad person, and so they can't be on that bad side of history. So I think there's space for a more complex analysis of what being Pākehā was and is in history that could move us past some of that kind of guilt and shame and disavowal.